Welcome to Left on Red, where a Gen X mom and gay millennial do socialism.
We've got left wing views on the news you can use.
I'm Scott,
I'm Susan.
and today we're here with Eric Blanc, a New York City DSA member who we're very proud to have, a writer here to talk about his new book, We Are the Union, an organizer with Ewok, and many, many, many more things. Welcome, Eric. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, comrades.
So I'm mostly excited to have you on to talk about the book, but I also, before we get into it, would love to talk a little bit about, I don't know, the news today.
Yeah, it's an interesting. Stylianos likes to say nothing happens, and I'm always just like, stuff is happening. So we're kind of two extremes of reacting to the news that comes out. Stuff happened that's directly relevant to labor, and stuff just happened that's just directly relevant to working people's lives. So we'd love to hear your take as a labor scholar, activist, someone who's intimately familiar with the National Labor Relations Board. Like, what's your take on what's been going on? Let's say the past week.
Sure. Actually, I want to start with a less doom and gloom update from the last 24 hours, because the other really big piece of news that happened, other than all of Trump's shenanigans, were that workers won the first ever union at a Whole Foods. And this is a really big deal under Amazon. This is a direct confrontation with Jeff Bezos. It's just a huge shot in the arm, I think, for the labor movement as a whole. And frankly, I was surprised that they won, because the company went so hard against them, firing worker leaders, giving a raise to every Whole Foods in Philadelphia except for their store. Just, really scorched earth tactics, the type of thing that most the time works to scare people. And nevertheless, workers voted 130 to 100 to vote in the union. And so this is just a really, really amazing victory. The workers are very heroic, very multiracial, young demographic. DSA, organizers are very involved, as workers. So it's something I think that we should not lose sight of in the midst of so much chaos that Trump has sort of unleashed. So on the Trump piece particularly, I would say that there's multiple dangers in how we think about this. One is overstating the extent of Trump's power, and I think that part of what he's doing is a bit of a shock and awe. Throw everything that he can, see what sticks, and sort of force people to cower in submission because it's just too overwhelming to even know what's going on. That being said, on the other hand, I think we also saw there's already a lot of backlash against the cross-the-board attacks that Trump has done, particularly with the funding freeze today. I mean, it felt like we lived through this whole big story in just 24 hours where Trump was going to essentially have all these traumatic cuts, and then there was pushback, and the judge pauses it. So I think that pattern is actually really important, because people at this point on the left, the biggest problem we have is doom and gloom. And, and I think it's really important to insist that actually Trump isn't invincible. He's not as strong as he seems, and we can win. So that's why I started off by talking about the union win and then foregrounding that. That being said, on the NLRB specifically, Trump went further than a lot of us thought he might. And what specifically he did is that he went beyond what Republican presidents normally do, which is to create a Republican majority board, which is, within their purview. Normally, you have to go by the calendar of sort of how long these terms last for the 5-person board. The National Labor Relations Board is governed by a 5-person board, and there's also a general counsel. So he fired General Counsel Jennifer Abruzzo, who is just an amazing, fighter for the working class, truly, a queen for anybody in the labor movement. Just no comparison. By far the best NLRB we've had since 1936. So he fired her. That's not illegal. That was expected. We all sort of knew that was going to come. There's no way that Trump was going to keep her in. But what he did beyond that is he fired somebody whose term was not done until 2028. And that's illegal. It's just he doesn't actually have the right to do that. And so it's going to take it to the court. And it's hard to know exactly what the dynamic is here. It might be that Trump is actively sort of creating a provocation to then throw the constitutionality of the NLRB to the Supreme Court in the hopes that it'll get overturned. It's also just possible, frankly, that he fired her to prevent the Democrats and the pro-union forces from having a majority on the board for the next few months, and that he'll, sort of go back to more status quo, and that they'll replace, they'll get back to quorum. Because the problem right now is they don't have quorum. There's only 2 members of the 5-person board right now. So the worry that some people have is that this would essentially paralyze the NLRB for the foreseeable future. I think, again, that's overstated. The national NLRB is not in charge of the day-to-day elections, which is the major thing that workers rely on. The NLRB at this point is mostly good for having a space for which workers can run local elections, and that legitimizes them. And then there's all of these other things after you win an election that the NLRB is supposed to do, which is, to fight against unfair labor practices and to help you win a contract. But to be honest, it's pretty bad at doing that. It's been, even under Abruzzo, it's not that great at doing that. So I don't want to overstate how screwed the NLRB is at the time being. Workers can still use it. They can still run elections. It's going to be harder. We knew it was going to be harder. And we're going to have to experiment to see how far we can go through the NLRB process. And if it turns out to basically be too onerous, then workers are going to have to organize outside the NLRB. And that's actually not so controversial. In the early 2000s, a lot of even mainstream unions organized outside the NLRB. There's ways of getting union without the NLRB. So it's not sort of the end of the labor movement by any means, but it is a very serious attack on the labor movement. And one of the things that this raises is whether the labor movement is going to rise to the occasion, both to fight back against this in a serious way, and then also just frankly to push back against all of the stuff that Trump is doing through concerted mass mobilizations, but then also by scaling up working class organizing. And it's, I think that's something we'll talk about over the, next few minutes, but it's not at all clear that the labor leadership in the United States is up to that task. And, there's going to be a lot of fights ahead to see how far they're willing to go or willing to be pushed.
We had guests on our last show who are Starbucks organizers. And one of the things we talked about is how there's been this generational shift in attitudes towards unions. So as the resident Gen Xer, my generation just didn't like unions. I was born around the shadow of the Patco strike and, that kind of thing. The AFL-CIO was dead by the time I was a college student. Whereas young people are we love a union, right? But in addition to this, there's been this, both young people organizing, right? The Gen Zs and the baby millennials, as well as this very favorable NLRB. As you said, I didn't know that, but one of the most favorable since the creation of the NLRB. Those two factors, institutional, I guess, cultural, social factors together, enabled this explosion of new organizing, exciting organizing, like Starbucks, like Amazon, Whole Foods. To what extent do you think that, this increased interest and support for unions is going to be able to carry on the movement in the face of a radically different institutional setting?
Yeah, it's a good question. It depends in part on what people like the listeners of the show do. It's hard to predict because it could go a lot of different ways. I'm relatively optimistic that it'd be possible to sustain laborist momentum. I don't think that under Trump we're going to sort of have the best case scenario for obvious reasons, of which would have been possible maybe even the last 4 years under Biden, which the labor movement organizes millions of workers and sort of we dramatically turn around union density. I think it's possible and perhaps even likely that the level of labor activity is sustained in the way that we've had over the last 4 years, which would be a win given the sort of very anti-union context. So to give a few reasons why that's the case. Well, partly, as you mentioned, it's just that there is this youth radicalization. The reason that we're seeing all of these drives pop off is in part because of just there's a young generation of radicals who are in the workforce who maybe went to Black Lives Matter protests, maybe volunteered for Bernie, A lot of them are in DSA. A lot of them are sort of consider themselves radicals of some sort. And they are unionizing. And that's not going to stop under Trump. It might make it a little bit harder, but that sort of layer of people is still there. So that's one factor. Another is that the labor market is still very tight. And so this is maybe sometimes overlooked. But when we're thinking about contextual factors that have made it possible for the union movement to sort of take off over the last few years, a tight labor market is an important part, because if you think, well, realistically, I could get a similar job to the one I'm at right now if I get retaliated against or fired for organizing, well, then you're willing to take more risks, or you're also willing to just demand more management because they need you more because they're short-staffed. So the labor market's still very tight, and this gives a lot of leverage for low-wage workers in particular. And then just more generally, the union movement has a ton of resources. The labor movement has over $38 billion in net assets that it's sitting on right now. Over a third of that is liquid. So we're just talking about a huge war chest that, if the labor movement decided to use, could go a really long ways towards scaling up new union organizing drives. The dynamic of the last 4 years has been that hundreds of thousands of new workers have been unionized. So this is actually a pretty significant number. Union density has declined because the number of workers hasn't caught up with the expansion of the economy and the population as a whole. But last year, over 100,000 workers unionized. The year before, it was about 100,000. The year before, it's just slightly less. So we're talking almost 300,000 workers. This isn't chump change. This is a lot of people who are building their power. And that took place despite the fact that the labor leadership was basically just doing business as usual. So it's pretty amazing. This is very different than past decades in which the sort of turn to organizing was driven from above. Here, it was despite the sort of inertia of the labor officialdom, workers from below drove this forward. And so what that means is, in part, if the labor leadership were to start funding new organizing, which is a big if, because frankly, they didn't do it in a serious way under Biden, and now under Trump, they likely continue to say, well, the conditions are too unfavorable. That's been their reigning assumption for the last few decades, is that conditions just aren't there to enable wide-scale organizing because labor law is too broken. So their orientation, insofar as they have one, because frankly, a lot of union leaders aren't thinking about anything beyond their sort of narrow fiefdoms. But insofar as there's any strategy whatsoever, it's, well, we'll elect Democrats, they'll eventually pass labor law reform and make it easier to unionize. The problem is that the Democrats don't actually pass labor law reform. It's not the top of their agenda. And then, frankly, even when the Democrats this time did, to their credit, have a good NLRB, the unions didn't seize the opportunity. So it raises the question, even when labor law was a little bit better, how are you actually going to unionize millions if you're not going to fund new organizing? So there's a big question mark about whether the labor movement will do it, but they have the resources to. And there is a world in which somehow the debacle of the Democrats in November creates some space for union leaders and unions to rethink the strategy, because it just frankly isn't working. It's sort of obviously not working. The Democrats are obviously in disarray and discredited. And so the idea that we're just going to sort of keep on doing what we've been doing and eventually it's going to turn around seems implausible. That I don't think most union leaders care enough about new organizing to reach the right conclusions. But if enough of them start shaking it up internally, there might be more space for new organizing than we might have expected. So I think the combination of those factors means that it will be possible to sort of sustain our current level of organizing, have some big wins, get Starbucks workers a first contract, continue having the United Auto Workers winning union elections, getting first contracts in the South, sort of spreading enough of these victories to keep new workers organizing. And I think that, I'll end with this, is that a big part of what we have to do over the next few years is not just sustain the momentum, but train tens of thousands of new worker leaders. This is really what it's going to require to organize millions of workers. Is we need a lot of people to learn through their experience and through training and through wins and through a lot of losses also what it takes to organize at work. And it's going to be that layer of worker leaders, some of whom will go on to become staffers, some of whom will continue to be sort of worker leaders on the shop floor. That's going to be the layer that is going to be necessary to have a labor movement that can organize millions. You wouldn't have had the 1930s in the US if you hadn't had radicals organizing at the shop floor in the 1910s and the 1920s, sort of preparing the way for the big win so that, of the 1930s. And I think that we have to have a similar orientation, looking at this as sort of a moment for continuing momentum and to be able to seize the next really big opening when it arises.
I appreciate the optimism. It's a very hopeful picture that you're painting right now, combining all of these favorable factors for new union organizing and this movement that you're talking about. And essentially, it's the thesis of your book, this worker-to-worker organizing model that's kind of shaking things up, that's not waiting or relying on union leadership to deploy all of those resources that you described before necessarily so neatly and uniformly, but workers who are organizing each other themselves. I want to be really hopeful, and I'm sorry to be I'm still in the doom and gloom stage. I did see some stats, and I know you were saying that there are 300,000 workers organized to unions, but the economy grew faster than that, and so union density is declining. I am still feeling a little like, well, union density remains pretty low and is declining, and we are seeing other losses and failures. But not to dwell on that, I would love to get into your book, We Are the Union, and talking about this worker-to-worker organizing that you were just essentially describing a little bit just now, and why you think this is going to shake things up such a way that it's going to counter some of these trends that we're seeing. And you sort of got into it, but I would love to hear maybe a description of what exactly worker-to-worker organizing is, how it's different from some of the ways that we might have traditionally viewed organizing. I think we all obviously see it in the name, but calling it out and kind of describing it might be really helpful. And how is that being promoted? How exactly is that working to counter all of these trends? How is that going to be big enough in this really big grassroots bottom-up swell to make the type of massive changes that we need in the labor movement in the United States right now?
Yeah, it's a big question. The short version of what the book is about, the really, really simple version, is it's a description of the recent upsurge in labor organizing, of the sort of heroic organizing efforts, and it's sort of inspirational. And if you're a worker interested in how you'd organize your workplace, if you read the book, you come away with like a lot of tips and inspiration for how you could do it. So part of the book is that simple, which is to sort of give a sense of what it takes to organize and build power at work by learning some of the lessons and hearing some of the stories of the post-pandemic upsurge. So that is part of it, but the broader strategic argument, and I think this is what you're asking about, is it's asking a question of what would it take to organize millions of workers? Because I think, Scott, what you said is right. As exciting as it's been, over the last few years, even with the uptick in labor organizing we've had, it hasn't been enough to turn around union density. And so the actual task is very daunting. What would it actually take to organize millions of workers? It's happened before, and we start to see inklings of how it could happen now. You can see the mechanisms through which you'd be able to do it, and I try to lay those out in the book. And essentially the argument is that the current model of labor organizing can't potentially do that. There's no world in which you're going to be able to organize millions of workers through the current dominant model of labor organizing.
For our listeners, just tell us a little bit about that.
For sure. That's right. Yeah. So what I call it staff-intensive organizing. That's sort of a catch-all term because there's a lot of different forms of staff-intensive organizing. But the crucial thing it has in common, all of its different iterations, is that it requires a lot of staff to unionize. And so, for instance, in this type of organizing, the best practice, the norm, is that you need one staffer for every 100 workers you're trying to unionize. Also, we have some decent data now on sort of the average cost of this organizing. It tends to cost about $3,000 for every one worker you're trying to unionize. So the basic limitation is that even at its best, because staff-intensive organizing at its best can be very effective, and so I'm not actually arguing in the book that staff don't matter and that resources don't matter. To the contrary, I think they matter a lot. But the problem with this specific model is it's not scalable because there's just not enough money and there's not enough staffers through which you could organize millions of workers this way. And I sort of break down the numbers in the book. But that raises then the question of, well, how would you do it? And I don't make an argument in the book, which some leftists have done before, which just sort of says, well, there'll be an upsurge. You just have to have confidence in the workers and eventually they'll rise up. There's some truth to that. I do think you have to have confidence in workers. And it is also true that labor movements tend to grow in spurts. But I think the problem with that orientation which sometimes romanticizes the 1930s, is it overlooks the extent to which the political economy and sort of social cultural context in which the working class exists is really different than in the 1930s. The working class has frankly been very atomized. We no longer live in very dense, associational rich neighborhoods next to our massive factories, and where all of our neighbors work at the same plant. We all go to the same church. We all play in the same sort of cards at the bar or whatever it is. Like that type of internal life of the working class, and it's different, and had all sorts of divisions back then too, has been sort of torn apart by the changes in capital, the rise of the service sector. The thing I focus on in the book a lot is the decentralization of industry and housing. So just the working class is a lot more spread out than it used to be. And so what this means then is that I don't think you can just rely and hope for this sort of mass upsurge in the same way that you might have been able to in the 1930s, or just think you can trigger it with a couple key wins that then sort of spontaneously get everyone else to erupt. There's some aspect of that which is true. The copycat factor, the viral factor is central to how you win big. But the book, and what I try to argue, makes the case that you need to be able to find ways essentially to do a lot of what the staff normally do, but have workers do them. So it's not actually that you don't need the roles of staff. These things are crucial. What do staff normally do? They help pass on lessons to workers, right? They help train workers. They help sort of pass on the cumulative knowledge from past struggles. They also have increased capacity. You need people who can spend just a lot of time doing the back end, sometimes very boring stuff like reaching out to workers, stapling picket signs, whatever it is. So you need experience and training and capacity. Those things really do matter. There's a reason why unions do staff-intensive organizing, because in these conditions, you need those capacities. The thing that we've seen in the recent unionization uptick, though, is that workers can do a lot of these and oftentimes do them just as good or better than staffers. So to give one example, you already talked about or you had recently on some Starbucks workers who are unionizing. Listeners may or may not remember that whole drive began in Buffalo. There was one union election in Buffalo. And that was initially just going to be a sort of local campaign. They had no intention of having a national campaign to organize Starbucks. They had very few resources. There's a bunch of salts. So salts is when you get a job in order to unionize it. And then they filed for an election, and to their great surprise, people started reaching out all over the country. And had it been a traditional union campaign, they basically would have had to say no to trying to organize Starbucks nationally. And this is actually what a lot of unions do. Unions very systematically and say no to workers reaching out all the time because they say they don't have resources. It's just too much. They can't spread themselves so thin. But fortunately, the people who organized in Buffalo were radicals, and they were leftists who had very ambitious sort of political instincts, even if their initial plan was more modest. And instead of then trying to rely on staffers, of which they just didn't have them, they literally just didn't have staffers who could talk to all these workers who were reaching out. They had the workers themselves who had unionized their shops start talking over Zoom with these dozens, then hundreds, and eventually thousands of workers across the country to talk through what it looked like to organize their shop and to pass on those lessons. So essentially they were functioning as in a way that the staffers would normally play, that they were training other workers across the country. So that's part of it, is training other workers. And then the other part of it, as far as worker-to-worker organizing that I talk a lot about in the book, is workers self-organizing before affiliating with a union. So this is, this was evident in all sorts of different big wins. The most famous of those was the Amazon Labor Union. So listeners probably remember JFK at Staten Island. They only recently affiliated with the Teamsters, and I think it's a good thing they did because they needed those resources. And I think that we've seen that going as an independent union against such a major corporation is like pretty daunting. So you want those resources, you want that sort of backup, but you need that combined with worker leadership. And so that's what we've seen all across the country, is that workers have started self-organizing. They're doing the things that in the past would only start once they were in touch with a union. They start doing systematic one-on-one conversations with their coworkers. They build an organizing committee. They map their workplace to find out who has the relations to who. Do you know that person? You talk to your coworkers to find out what the deeply felt and widely felt issues are. What is the thing that's going to move people to action, right? All of these steps people have been learning partly by reading about what other workers do, partly by reading Jane McAlevey or labor notes, partly by being in socialist organizations like DSA. These types of lessons have been passed on worker to worker rather than having to have staff pass them on. So then workers can start self-organizing on their own, and then they eventually, most of the time, end up affiliating with the union because workers understand that they want these resources. But it changes the dynamics, because when you self-organize at first and then you connect with the union, it tends to be more of a partnership rather than a relationship of deference, which is often the case in traditional unionism, in which sort of workers assume the staff and the union sort of outside of itself is the be-all, end-all for strategy, and they tend to actually learn less in that experience because they are taking their lessons from others rather than sort of co-creating the strategy with staffers or other workers. So it's more democratic, it's more scalable, and we've seen that it also wins. So I talk in the book about not just the promise of what it could look like, but of really important victories that have been won. It's not just that unions are winning elections, but they've won first contracts, because this is the knock against the model. It's like, oh, you can win a union election, but can you actually win a first contract? So I go out of my way in the book to say, yeah, actually this skepticism is very baseless. The union that has been most sort of successful at developing a worker-to-worker program, which is the News Guild, which organizes journalists, they've had hundreds of first contracts in extremely difficult fights, going up against these horrible hedge funds that are destroying the journalism industry. They've won a ton of first contracts. So the model works, and I give other examples of Colectivo, which is a chain in the Midwest, Burgerville, which is a chain on the West Coast, and then Starbucks, which has come really close. They forced the company to the bargaining table, and I'm optimistic that they'll get a first contract. So we're seeing it's winning, it's scalable, but in order to actually organize millions of people, you still need this influx of resources, which we haven't seen from the labor movement. This has happened, we've seen over the last few years, has happened, as I mentioned before, despite the basically cratering of funding for new organizing. And so for it to scale, you would need a real investment in this type of organizing and the model of worker-to-worker approach generally.
I'm kind of hearing that, like, back in the day, like during the golden age of union density, there were resources that were social, not like financial, like things like, people being socially, densely living close together, working in large factories, and also having like a work culture, like the bar. I always think about books, right? So there's Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. And he says that, we used to be like a society where we bowled and we had bowling leagues and we had all these associations. We went to church, and now we're more alienated. We're at home. We're not hanging out with friends. There's like that article, like the case for hanging out with your friends in like the Atlantic. And like, a lot of things are causing this like decline in civic associational life. But like what I'm also hearing is that those conditions haven't changed, right? Like women are still working, right? Like we still are like suburbanized and we're still atomized, but the pandemic and sort of new technologies have created new forms of associational life. Like, the people who organized in the News Guild, it's like a completely remote workplace. Well, they organized using Zoom and like private Slack channels, and maybe, I don't know, what is it that the gamers use? Stylianos? Huh? Discord. They use like private Discord, like what are they called? Servers, right? Where the employer couldn't see it, the boss couldn't see it, right? But that they created their own like collective social spaces to organize because they don't ever see each other in person. And also like Starbucks is a place where you physically have to go, right? So even if workers worked all over the city, they were physically like at this place because it was the nature of the work itself, allowed them to create these like tight communities and like relationships that were important for this kind of worker-to-worker organizing that you couldn't replicate in a more atomized or siloed like shop floor setting, like a factory. I think that's very interesting. I'm like obsessed with Putnam because these conditions
Putnam's great. I
also,
love Putnam.
right? Like these conditions also allow for someone like Trump to come in, right? And I think that like I have a personal story. We tried to organize a union when I was a grad student at Minnesota, and we went with UE because we were very pure and we wanted to have an independent organizing effort. And they threw a lot of resources into us, and we lost. 2004 or 2005, we lost. UAW came in. They were very slick. We said no to them. They came in 2011. They paid the graduate students to become full-time organizers. They paid them $50,000 a year, which in 2011 was a lot of money for a grad student in Minneapolis. And they lost by even more than we lost. 2024, University of Minnesota went with UE again. They won by 90%. So sometimes it's like the resources don't even matter. The UAW sank so many resources. In 2011, the context wasn't right. Like we didn't have kids in tech, like grad PhD students in the tech and STEM world who had any solidarity with workers. In 2024, it was opposite, right? Like we had 100% support and like vote yes in all these STEM departments that wouldn't even talk to us in 2004. Right, like the young people, like God bless them, right? Their attitudes towards union, no matter where they were, like department wise, it was just the weirdo humanity kids, straight scientists like physics and theoretical math, not applied math, and social scientists who'd ever talk about the union. Now it was across the board. So context does matter as well, and I think that that's like part of the social resources that have emerged with this population of young people who are organizing.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's. The atomization question is a good one. The argument I make in the book is comparing the level of sort of class cohesion even before you start organizing to the 1930s, and it certainly declined. And it's part of the reason then like you need different models, you need different approaches. But on the other hand, I would also stress the converse, which is that the workplace remains in an atomized society one of the few places where you do have this level of sociality, even when it's remote. I mean, in part because it's one of the few places that still connects us to a lot of different people. So I think one of the reasons that people have unionized is that they were craving a sense of community. And part of the power of the organizing that has happened is that people found each other in hard times, the pandemic, but then also just in the process of fighting the boss is extremely stressful. It's like war. And you come out on the other end feeling like that person who you went through hell with will always have your back. There's an intensity of solidarity and camaraderie that comes out of struggles like this that I find very moving. So I try to talk about that in the book and give it sort of a bit of a sense of what that's like. But it's a transformative experience. If you've ever organized your workplace, you are not the same person at the end of that. Your coworkers aren't the same. And even when you lose, your workplace isn't the same because the process of organizing has changed your entire relationship to each other. It's changed your relationship to work. And so I do think that's part of the reason why there has been this uptick in organizing. It's a space for people to find a meaningful way to come together. And I find that encouraging. And I actually also find it encouraging that a lot of these workplaces, as you mentioned, were remote. I interviewed some of the people in the book who said, I literally haven't met anybody on our organizing committee in person in my whole life. And we just won our union election. And I also know everything about their families and their kids because we're best friends now. But they live across the country, because it was an all remote workplace. And I find that moving because there's this sense of, the doom and gloom again, that everything's just going downhill and the social media is alienating. I actually try to push back against that in the book. I have this whole chapter on digital tools, in which the thrust of it is actually, okay, yeah, it's bad. Trump can spread disinformation. We know all that stuff. But actually, look, it's pretty amazing. Workers were able to self-organize in part because they had all these tools. They wouldn't have been able to do that 10 years ago, frankly, in the pre-Zoom era. You couldn't have had a Buffalo worker training a worker in Mesa, Arizona, just like that. People weren't used to it. And you would then would have had to rely much more on established unions. The digital stuff lowers organizing costs. And so it allows for workers to sort of do it on their own or with relatively fewer sort of resources from unions than it would have been possible in the past. So I think that the tech piece, at least when it's connected to good organizing and not just sort of shallow mobilizing where you sort of put out a petition online or just ask people to tweet something, it can counterintuitively, the tech can go towards actually a much deeper sense of community and organization than a lot of people, I think, currently assume.
It reminds me, you both mentioned News Guild, and it's sort of funny listening to you talk, Eric. My boyfriend organized a union at his workplace a few years ago, eventually going with News Guild. And now I'm listening to you talk, and I'm like, oh, I noticed all of the stuff that you're describing happening. A lot of it was remote. He was on, for once in our lifetimes, he was on as many Zoom meetings a week as I was. And I also noticed that it was him and his coworkers, right? And so there was just like this organizing committee of workers doing the organizing and very little involvement from staff. The staff were kind of like the coaches or the people in the background helping you out, but ultimately it was this worker to worker organizing model. And I'm thinking about all of this stuff that I was seeing, and I was clearly witnessing exactly what you're talking about in the book. It reminds me a lot of DSA. Everything that you're describing is a clear example of how DSA, as this volunteer-led and run, member-to-member model, works differently than maybe a traditional progressive nonprofit where the staff make the decisions and tell everyone what to do, and you just kind of like are a member of the nonprofit. Maybe you're on an email list. Obviously there's many other differences, but it reminds me a lot of how we see so many people enter DSA, learn all of these skills, teach everyone else all of these skills, and now all of a sudden you have these large collective groups of people that are organizing each other and teaching each other how to do all of this different type of work. And it's beginning to make me think, we're talking about atomization and these technical skills, almost like we need a new analysis or an updated analysis of capitalism. One of the ways that I understood that Marx was talking about capitalism and its class formation was that because it's centralized workers in urban environments and then in these factories and these industrial environments, that cohered a working class. And with all of these levels of atomization and individualization, and we're no longer associated, we kind of maybe need an updated model that takes into account all of the digital stuff that you're talking about. And how does that cohere a class? Is there a class formation happening on social media or virtually through these remote tools? Does that look different? You're saying, yes, it contributes to separation and atomization, but it also clearly can be a powerful tool for connection.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's also just, you can look at what the right wing does. They're smart about it. They do a lot of digital agitation and organizing because they know that's where people are getting the ideas. But they also, think about Trump. Trump has these massive rallies. So it's not mutually exclusive, right? There is something about being surrounded by a lot of people in close proximity that has a power that you don't get even at best online. So I don't think it's one or the other. And I think that basically we should study what the right wing is doing more because they're just frankly better. They're out organizing us. And I would say this as a sort of a gentle provocation of us on DSA, because Scott, I agree with you. The worker-to-worker piece is in many ways similar to DSA. I think what's different, the main thing that to me strikes me initially when you said that that's different, is that the nature of unionization requires you to speak a lot more systematically and effectively to people who disagree with you. And I feel like that is still not really so. It's not necessarily the best thing we do as DSA. I think DSA oftentimes, I'm trying to say it in as nice a way as possible, but oftentimes people join DSA self-selecting, right? People hear about it online, or whatever, they're socialists, and they come in and we recruit a lot of people that way, and that's good. But we haven't been very good at reaching out beyond our existing demographics and sort of types of people who join us on their own, in a way that to build a union, you almost always have to do, because you can't win a union without really reaching and sort of cohering people who don't necessarily agree with you. You can sort of do that in DSA. I don't think you can do that with a DSA that would have hundreds of thousands of members and be where we need to go. So all of that is to say, I think that the DSA we want to build is probably more like a union in which we are recruiting people by having deep conversations with them, by listening to them. What are their issues? What's widely and deeply felt in our communities, and sort of finding ways for the social piece of it. Also, I think is an important one. People come involved not just for the high ideas, but because they feel like, oh yeah, this is a meaningful place where I'm meeting people. And so I think that maybe DSA has something to learn from the recent unionization wave for how it could really deepen its roots in the broader working class.
Well, I will say that Donald Trump is creating like the crisis that motivates people to join a union. All kinds of people are joining DSA right now who don't match our typical profile. Stylianos has been leading the 101s. I'm not saying it's enough, but I do think that people are, like you said, they want that community. And so they might look for it at work, but they're also looking to create a political home. And it is something that I'm trying to find solace in as I doom scroll daily about the new nightmares that Trump and his team have cooked up on a daily basis. But I appreciate all the things that you're saying. Organized labor is going to be a very important part of the resistance 2.0 under Trump, which is not a thing at all compared to 2017. Like 2017 was a very different vibe, and now I don't know what the vibe is. But like, there's no rallies.
I want the vibe to be workplace organizing. The best case scenario is that people channel their anger at Trump into workplace organizing, which it can be like a direct thing against Trump. So like, let's say Trump wants to do mass deportations. Well, teachers should go on strike to prevent ICE from deporting the parents of their kids. It's like, they can do that. They have the ability to do that. Like, they should. The federal government workers are getting attacked by Trump. They should threaten to go on strike if Trump's going to like screw them over. There's this level of power in unionization that I think answers the question that people have, which is, well, what do you do, right? This is the paralysis people have around Trump. It's like, oh, he's horrible, but would he listen to us if we go to another protest? I think protests are good. We should do more protests. But there is something about the power of withholding your labor and the power of building a union that just, I think, hopefully will be attractive in sort of propelling a different type of resistance to Trump. This is the hope, and remains to be seen whether it happens. But it seems conceivable to me that it will. We saw it even under Trump last time a bit. Think about like the Red State Revolt with the teacher strikes, or like Sarah Nelson ending the federal government shutdown by threatening a general strike. So you saw aspects of that, which is in many ways how the current labor upsurge started, kind of out of this late Trump worker resistance. And now we have all this labor momentum, and there's far more workers, than in 2016, 2017 are oriented towards unionizing. So it's a very explosive mix. I have no idea what happened to I felt like we lived through a year just today. So who knows what's going to happen in a week or two. But the idea that it's just going to be sort of one bad thing after another is true as far as like what Trump will do. But I don't actually think I think that really misses how volatile the situation is, how weak Trump is in certain ways, and how many openings there are, in part because the liberal resistance is also weaker. That creates this huge opening for the labor movement and, potentially the socialist movement as well, because the Democrats are in disarray. The resistance sort of with a capital R isn't really there. And so that's scary, but it also means that, well, maybe we can channel people's anger in a more productive and more sort of class-based way.
Here's a final question based on what you just said, and based on what Susan just said too. We're still getting, the vast majority of people that are joining DSA are coming in through that passive model, which I've written about, that it's nice, but I truly wish we desperately need to find out an active model for convincing people, right? Rather than this passive model of pulling people in. But we did an event, DSA 101 on Sunday, and one of the speakers, we did it with AOC's office at the location in Jackson Heights. One of the speakers was Kristen Gonzalez, our state senator here in Queens, Manhattan, and Brooklyn.
Kristen brought her dog.
Yeah, she did. I was holding Sunny the whole time, which was very cute. He was very sweet. And at the event, there was a woman in the audience, and it was a really diverse crowd. Tons of people, lots of immigrants, really lovely. I know I'm going to take it like a million hours to go through all of those stories. One really beautiful man making all these great analogies. It was really sweet. I loved hearing him talk. But there was a woman in the crowd who, after Kristen spoke about technology issues, because she was the chair of the technology committee in the Senate, about tech workers and tech worker laws to protect them. And this woman spoke and said, I'm worried about my job. What are the things that are going to protect me? And Kristen told her, you should unionize. That's the best way, regardless of what the laws look like, regardless of what's happening, only you and your coworkers have that power. And the woman responded, I don't think that's possible. And kept, there was this like back and forth where Kristen kept saying, here's all the things that you can do. Here's what you can have power with. organizing at your workplace. And this woman just kept saying, I can't organize. I can't do it. It's not going to happen in my workplace.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people probably right now who are joining DSA think the same thing. I think a lot of people think of DSA as the place to do politics, partially because they think they can't do that at their workplace. They can't organize with their coworkers. They can't form a union. And it might be because they're in tech or some other professional or office-based industry where there traditionally haven't been a ton of unions. And so they think that, my job is not a union job.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how we convince those people, or what thoughts you have, especially with this worker-to-worker model, which has seen success in the tech industry in some ways. What do we say to someone like that who's just really like, I don't think it can happen in my workplace?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. The easy answer, which I just don't think would be so helpful necessarily with this person, but the sort of pat answer is that actually most unionization over the last few years has been tended to happen in like outside of hard industry. So there's this sort of very outdated notion that unionization is just for like dudes in hard hats, and that's just not the case. The biggest number of wins we've seen just by sheer numbers of workers were the graduate student wins of the last few years. And so you've seen tech, you've seen it in sort of white collar work. So just as sort of as a point of fact, that is one of the major areas where there has been an uptick. But I think for somebody who's coming in from that, just throwing those facts at them won't really convince them. You really have to like talk them through. This is what an organizing conversation is. So when somebody says, I can't have a union, then you have to ask why. And so it's hard because this person isn't here, but most of the time they'll say, well, because we all work very far from each other, or my coworkers are just like totally apathetic, or they're just totally conservative, right? Or the boss would fire us all. And what my experience is that most of the time when people say we can't have a union here, I would say 9 out of 10 times, they raise the exact same questions and doubts that every single worker raises about whether they could have a union here. It's not actually particular to their workplace. This is just the thing that you always have to confront. It's always the case that the boss will threaten workers, or almost always the case. It's always the case that a lot of your coworkers, at least superficially, don't seem like they're going to want to join in something like this, right? Because otherwise you'd probably already have a union because they would have been asking you to join, right? And so that's what organizing is. You have to like talk with a lot of your coworkers, find out what the deeply felt issues are, find out who has the relationships. How do you build an organizing committee? One thing I would say to a person like that is sometimes they think that they have to do it on their own, right? And so in EWOC, Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, I imagine most listeners know what EWOC is, but in case you don't, you should, sign up, you could tell it to her too. It's like, you don't have to do this on your own. You can reach out to EWOC, go to workerorganizing.org. An experienced organizer will reach out to you within 72 hours and to hear more about your workplace, and then also talk you through some of these steps, because every single thing that you mentioned is a thing that happens elsewhere. And there are time-tested things that you can do to overcome all of these. So you can overcome the fear factor from management. You can overcome the apathy of, quote unquote, apathy of your coworkers. You can overcome the distance, if it's a remote workplace. All of these things workers have figured out how to do. We know what it takes. You don't have to start from scratch. And then when you talk about them, then you just keep on asking questions. Good organizing, and this is why it's hard at a big forum like that. You're not really going to have an organizing conversation with the time. But, most of it's listening, and you have to ask their person, what is going on, what are their doubts. But you find that in the process of asking a lot of good questions, that people will end up oftentimes answering their own questions. The question is like, well, why do you think a union can happen? What if this were to happen? What if you were to do this? And then people are like, oh, well, yeah, maybe, I could see that. What if you were to talk to one coworker tomorrow, see what they think? There's ways of making it sort of more digestible, so it doesn't seem so overwhelming. That's essentially what we do in EWOC, and it's what I think any good union organizer does, is it talks to people through that process.
We invited her to the monthly EWOC worker circle here in New York City, and I hope she goes. I sent her an email with the link as a follow-up as well. Worker circle is really lovely. They gather workers together to do exactly what you're describing. They talk about their experiences, and you're kind of in this kind of smaller, more intimate space, and you get to talk these things through. But with that, Eric, thank you so much. Eric Blanc, everybody, with his new book, We Are the Union. I hope you check it out. Is there anything else you want to pitch?
There's going to be the launch event for the book, which is going to be Wednesday, February 26th at the People's Forum. So New York City DSA is organizing it together with EWOC and Starbucks Workers United New York and the Debt Collective and I think somebody else who I'm forgetting.
Is there a virtual option?
There's not going to be a virtual option
Okay.
for this. There will be there's a national book study group around this book, which I'm sort of excited about. So that is going to be on March 3rd. If you haven't seen the emails already, you can check it out. But you can go to my social media and get the details. But we're going to do a national Zoom event on March 3rd with me and Kim Kelly, labor author, and then Mo Mills, who's the Starbucks Workers United worker organizer. So that's going to be March 3rd online. But if you're in New York City, come in person. It's going to be fun. Jacobin is the other co-sponsor. And Alex Press from Jacobin, amazing, is going to be emceeing the event. So it would be me and a bunch of worker leaders from Amazon and Starbucks there. And then we'll have a party afterwards. So hopefully you'll see you there in person and on the Zoom. And yeah, hopefully folks get a copy. It's like 50% off. If you sign up for the study groups. So, I really
Right.
Love a good
Amazing.
deal.
Stylianos famously doesn't really read, but we'll read your book.
I'll read the
You can
book.
read it. You can read it to him.
I have a 1 month a book New Year's one book a month New Year's resolution for 2025, and I'm gonna make it this year.
It's gonna quadruple his book inventory
Yes.
in his mind.
Thank you so much, Eric. This was such a not just like interesting and engaging conversation, but one that made me feel a little bit more hopeful after everything today.
That's good.
And I hope if you're listening, it made you feel hopeful too. I'm Scott,
I'm Susan.
and solidarity forever.